Hi folks, Tom Goodwin here, Assistant Curator at the Owl's Head Transportation Museum. Over the course of this series, we've learned that the history of the Model T is actually longer than the history of modern cars. We've also cooked hot dogs on a Model T manifold, and we've grilled the experts on charcoal. We almost learned how to drive a Model T, except that Warren left.
Squeeze the handle, and that saves wear and tear on the pawl and parts.
So, don't do it like this to save wear and tear on the parking brake. Justifiably so. Little does he know, he's not the only tea-savvy teacher in the sea. I'm sorry, this must be the wrong interview?
You're Tom, right?
Tom.
I'm Phil, and I'm going to be showing you how to start a Model T engine today.
But you're like 12.
I'm 22.
Why do you care about old-timey stuff instead of hanging out in snack chat rooms and posting on the gram?
I do plenty of that, but I grew up around old cars, volunteering here at the museum. I liked it so much I went to school at McPherson College to restore old cars, and now I make my living restoring old cars.
I still don't believe that you're not just some kind of historian disguised as a millennial, but I'll bite. What's going on here?
This is a Model T cutaway. This is a Model T chassis and engine, everything that makes the car go down the road without a body. So today, I'm going to be showing you how to start the Model T engine.
You lost me at McPherson.
Do you know how an engine works?
Do I have to?
Certainly helps. The basics of an internal combustion engine is the four-stroke principle. The Model T engine is 4 cylinders, and we have 1 cylinder cutaway so we can see what's happening in there. So we need a fuel source first off, and the fuel source comes from the gas tank through a little line to the carburetor, which is essentially a mixing device. You have a hole for the air to come through and a line for the fuel. After it's mixed, it regulates how much of that mixture goes into the engine with the throttle, goes up the intake manifold, which painted green, to your intake valves at every cylinder. So we're going to start our first stroke of the 4-stroke cycle, which is the intake stroke. As the piston travels down, the intake valve opens, and the piston creates a low pressure area, which sucks the air and the fuel in. Now we begin the second stroke, which is called the compression stroke. As the piston travels back up, the intake valve closes, and it squeezes that air and fuel mixture. The more compression you have, the more energy will be released when it ignites. Somewhere around top dead center, which is the top of the piston's travel, usually a little bit before top dead center, the spark plug will fire, igniting the air and fuel mixture. And that exploding air and fuel forces the piston back down, turns the crankshaft, turns the transmission, and turns your rear wheels. That's the third stroke. That's the power stroke. Now, to start all over again, we have to get all that burnt air and fuel out. So we start the exhaust stroke, which the exhaust valve opens as the piston starts traveling back up, and it forces the burnt gases out the exhaust valve, out the manifold, out the tailpipe.
And then it just repeats.
And it repeats over and over again. Well, let's go take a look at a real Model T engine.
Oh, okay. Ooh.
So here is a 1914-ish Model T engine that has been set up on this stand to run completely on its own out of the car.
Okay.
Warren went over pre-check with you. Right?
Yes.
All right. So we can get right to the running of the engine. Now things are a little different obviously because the engine's out of the car, so the controls are in different places.
Oh boy.
This is your throttle.
Okay. It's like gas pedal type sort of.
Exactly.
Yeah.
In a complete Model T, that would be on the right-hand side of the steering column.
Okay.
Here is your spark control, which on the Model T would be on your left-hand side of the steering column.
Those little arms that do that.
They are. When you are starting an early car, nearly all of them will have some kind of a spark control. Nowadays, the car's computer does that for you. We don't want the engine to kick back. That's how people break arms and all that good stuff.
You mean that thing can hurt me?
That can hurt you. What we want to do to make it easier to start from cold is we want to prime it. So we want a little bit of air and fuel in each of these cylinders to help it fire up. The engine has a choke like a lawnmower or chainsaw right here, and that's operated by the little pull up there on the front. And this is where the choke would be on a complete Model T.
Okay.
But we're going to cup the crank with our hand, with our thumb below it.
Like that?
Like this. Thumb under the crank. If your thumb was over the crank, it could take your hand with it, which you don't want. So you put the thumb underneath it, and so if it does kick back, it just spits the crank out of your hand, in theory.
Okay.
Pull the choke out and crank it over through 4 compression strokes, 1 for each cylinder. So
3.
and then one more. 4. And there it is. The engine's prime.
Okay.
On the ignition side of things, the Model T has 2 ways to power the ignition. We have a battery or a magneto. We're going to turn on the battery side.
Okay.
So the battery will fire these coils, and we have a coil for each individual spark plug like a modern car. Once it's running, we have a magneto on the flywheel, a series of magnets, and when it's spinning, it generates its own electricity, so it doesn't even need a battery to run.
So kind of like an alternator?
Kind of like a primitive alternator.
Okay.
Yes. So I'm going to turn on the battery. So you hear the coil buzzing.
That's a good noise.
Yes. That means the coil is firing.
I'm going to pull this to start it and then slowly advance this.
Once it's running.
Gotcha. And pull straight up.
Yep. And make sure thumb's under the crank.
Yep, we're good. Hey! Oh. Come on. And that's the throttle?
Gas pedal, yep. So that'll idle it, you pull it forward, it'll rev it.
Well, folks, I started a Model T.
Well, half.
You mean I half started it?
You started half a Model T.
That's not funny. What do we do now?
That's all he told me to do.
I did it. I started a Model T. Well, half a Model T. And it turns out young people can care about that too. Phil certainly does. I'm beginning to get a better sense of how fond the child Harold Wills must have been of the technology of his time. Join us next time when I finally get to try my hand at driving a Model T. I'm actually really excited. Do you think we should open a window?
Yeah, probably.